So first up we have Dr. Senraj. Dr. Senraj is an Associate Professor in Human Rights Law at Manchester Law School and Chair of Amnesty International UK. He's passionate about glitter, unicorns, pop culture and social justice. Please welcome Sen.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Steph. I also want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. It's a pleasure to be on Gadigal country, and thank you for having me here today. I'm here to talk about fabulousness, or being fabulous, if you like, which is something that is near and dear to my heart. Apologies, I'm not as sparkly as I usually am, but I've just kind of de-sparkled from Mardi Gras, and it's still taken a bit of time to get all those last remnants of glitter off me. But, you know, bear with me as I kind of take you on a really quick whistle-stop tour through what fabulousness can mean as a kind of political aesthetic and a form of resistance. So, fabulous. It's a weighty word. It inspires images of sparkle, of joy, of ferocity, of sass, of beauty. But it also carries with it a kind of shadow. A shadow that's often marked by ideas of trauma, violence, and vulnerability. So I'm here to kind of talk about that relationship, and I'm very much inspired by the work of performance artist Madison Moore, who wrote a fabulous book called Fabulous, and in it they detail quite carefully how being fabulous often starts with a trauma. And it's about our expression of beauty as a result of the strength and trauma that we have faced in life. And so to think about being fabulous is to also think about occupying spaces where you're creative, where you dress a particular way, where you're unapologetic in how you present yourself, regardless of the hostility or violence you may face as a consequence of that. For those of us who are queer, who are trans, who are part of the quote-unquote rainbow community, we might recognize that in our everyday lives. We might recognize what it means to be fabulous, to have that sense of value and worth, even as people constantly harass, taunt, intimidate us for who we are. And so to be fabulous isn't always just about being sparkly at a pride parade. It's about walking down the street dressed in a way that feels comfortable to you. It's about being at home and being able to, you know, share intimacy with someone that you love without worrying that what you're doing might risk criminalization or policing or persecution, right? So when we think about being fabulous, it's about who we are as people. It's about the resistance to a system that oppresses us, that marginalizes us, and that wants to limit our visibility. And the reason why being fabulous is so important, I think, as an aesthetic, and it's something that I think can really anchor us in the world, is because we are in a world at the moment that we see great hostility towards those who don't conform. We're seeing increasingly authoritarian attacks around the world against sexual and gender visibility that does not conform to kind of cis heteronormative ideas about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be in a quote-unquote traditional relationship. And it's so important for us to resist that. And we're finding ways of organizing through our communities, and we find fabulousness in each other. I mean, you know, the parades, the prides, the spaces we create for ourselves, those are fabulous spaces, and those are spaces for joy, for beauty, for celebration, but also for solace and recharge in a world that constantly attacks us. And we use those spaces to then push forward, to fight and to resist those oncoming attacks. I mean, just recently I was looking at the US, where we're seeing the attacks on drag queens who are going to libraries to read stories to children. You know, we're seeing the language of gender ideology proliferate around the world, not only to attack kind of LGBTIQA+ communities, but also to attack reproductive health care. You know, the rights of Indigenous communities. We're seeing attacks on migrants and people who seek asylum. So when I talk about finding your own sense of fabulousness, it's not just about as individuals. It's also about the communities and relationships that are made possible because of who we are and how we connect to one another. And so, as I kind of look at the time down the clock just to make sure I'm not overrunning, I want to kind of think about how we can organize in this current moment and where we can go. And so, as I mentioned before, there's lots of, amazing pop culture, queer pop culture now that really highlights a lot of this kind of, aesthetic of fabulousness. And it draws inspiration from the ball houses, led by Black and brown Latinx folks in the US. There's the show Pose, which I'm sure many of you here are familiar with, which really articulates, I think, quite brilliantly that to be fabulous is not to be without trauma. It's not to be free from fault or flaw. It's to remind us that we are all flawed beings, and that's what trauma does to you. But it's also about how we derive strength and how we organize politically in those moments, because that can be a real challenge. And we see that within our own communities as well. So I think as we think about this concept of being fabulous, I want to kind of encourage people and push people to think beyond the kind of the glitz and the sparkle, if you like, the kind of more tokenized representations of fabulousness, to the kind of origins of the concept, particularly for queer and trans communities that have used and anchored themselves around this term. Because it has been a way of connecting to ourselves and connecting to each other. And in this current political environment, that's more important than ever. Here in Australia, we are seeing the increasing kind of polarization of issues relating to, say, trans and non-binary people. We're seeing a lack of recognition for intersex people, particularly around the issues that they face around bodily autonomy and access to appropriate healthcare. We're seeing intersections as well for people who seek asylum. We talk about how great it is to be in Australia, for example, how progressive and how wonderful it is. And it certainly is for a lot of people. And, I, for one, have experienced such great things from living here on a personal level. And yet, at the same time, it is a site of great violence and trauma for people as well, who aren't able to be themselves, who aren't able to express their fabulousness because systems and structures diminish who they are, marginalize them. If I were to use another example for a moment, think about people who seek asylum here in Australia. The ways in which our offshore and interdiction processes have functioned to effectively outsource the kind of processing of people who seek asylum, and importantly and dangerously have meant that they've been sent to places where their own lives and liberties have been at risk, where, for example, they've been sent for processing places that still criminalize, for example, homosexuality. And so when we think about this language of progress as well, I want us to be quite critical and a bit cautious, which is why kind of, again, when we talk about being fabulous, we also have to be a real kind of self-critical about how we're using it, particularly because we're living in a moment now where lots of people like to talk about the progress that we have made. And that's wonderful. Here we are at Sydney World Pride, 2023, commemorating many, many things that we've achieved, both here in Australia and globally as well, and that's wonderful. But it is also absolutely a moment where we don't need to keep telling ourselves, or certainly having politicians tell us constantly, how wonderful things must be and how grateful we all should be or feel, because, we're lucky to live here, for those of us who do. I live in the UK now, but I still have easy access to Australia being a citizen, for example, which is a privilege in itself. And so, when I think about these moments, I think about why fabulousness is so powerful a term, because it reminds us of the trauma and the violence and the victimization we have faced, but also how that vulnerability has shaped communities of resistance, right? We still see people protesting, importantly, not just for our own communities, but for communities that intersect with our own, right? And that is so important, that is so valuable. And so as, we marched down Mardi Gras on Saturday night, and it was wonderful. I marched with Amnesty International here in Australia. It's wonderful to be surrounded by people who share the similar kinds of commitments you do, and to, find joy and celebration, but also be reminded of, the fact that there are still about 70 countries that criminalize homosexuality, but also there are countries that engage in social, political, and economic violence that may not necessarily be legal in many other parts of the world, including places that like to talk about how great they are on LGBT rights. And we can see that right now in the context of the UK, in the US, here in Australia, countries that often hold themselves out to the rest of the world as beacons of progress, beacons of where it's easy to be gay or to be queer. And yet we know that that isn't the case. There are still legal and legislative impediments for people to live their lives, getting legal gender recognition, being able to access healthcare, for example. But there are also social and political taboos that mean that, yeah, we'll tolerate you, we'll allow you to access our spaces, we'll allow you to assimilate into our culture, but we won't allow you to really express yourself. We won't allow you the visibility on your own terms, because to do that would be to corrupt society, And that's something that I find quite, funny in many ways, or hilarious, considering how, for many of us, we grew up, surrounded by, cis people, heterosexual people flaunting their lifestyles in our faces constantly, and yet we somehow managed to stay queer and trans in the process. And so, I like to think about that as our fabulousness as well. We are a resilient bunch, considering how susceptible other people seem to be to sort of propaganda, quote unquote. We have managed to survive and thrive. And that's something that I really take heart from, and something that actually is why in those moments where I see great struggle, I also see great strength. When we look around the world and people are struggling, we're seeing all around the world, in different parts of the world, people fighting for reproductive justice, people fighting for the end of criminal laws, people fighting to be able to go to workplaces, people fighting to be able to, access healthcare in an equitable way, people fighting for basic education. These rights, people are fighting on a number of different levels, and they're doing so creatively, and they're doing so with their communities. And that's the real strength of the people here, the people in this room, you all here, and the people who are in the other rooms here today. And that's something that I'm so proud about and so passionate about, something that I draw strength from. And so, it's nice to have this talk at the start of a conference like this, because it hopefully kind of energizes you and kind of engages you to think about your own sense of what fabulousness means to you, and why it's such a powerful term to you, and how you relate to it, in whatever way you relate to it. It might not be a word that comes at the forefront of your life or your existence. You might not really even think about it that often, but there are probably aspects to your life that are fabulous, that you are able to express certain things, you are able to engage in certain things, you're able to organize your life and those around you in a way that is actually meaningful and powerful, even in the face of great, hostility or degradation or humiliation or vilification. And I think that's a real strength. And that's why we're here in this space today. And hopefully, as you leave the conference afterwards, you carry that with you and you think about how you can use this, not only for your own life and kind of to emphasize and encourage you to live fabulously, but how you build those fabulous communities, how you draw from trauma, how you draw from those spaces, because as I've said, we're all flawed. We all have trauma to varying degrees, whether it's in relation to our sexuality, our gender, our race, our culture, if we're disabled by society, many, many things intersect and compound, as we know. But yet we are able to draw strength. We are able to work in such ways that allow us to thrive, that allow us to flourish in the world. And so, please, this is the activist in me, always sort of trying to encourage people to go out and do more, to organize. So, after my talk today, hopefully, and of course all the talks here today in this session, I hope you feel that kind of sense of inspiration, that sense of wonder, that sense of reflection and curiosity as well. And go out and harness that energy and, make change, because let's be honest, we are facing increasing hostility around the world, not just globally, but locally, nationally. And while we have so many things to celebrate, we still have so much more work to do to ensure that we can create a world where everyone can thrive in freedom, in love, in safety, in joy, in visibility, and of course, in fabulousness. So, thank you.
We are breathing.